Little Stupid sat beside the stove, rested the silver saucer on her lap, set the glass apple upon it, and turned it widdershins, chasing time backwards. As it spun, there in the heart of the apple, she saw the beginnings of the world and all that came after. She saw a four-pointed signpost quartering up a cloud-crested sky. She saw a golden bird circling a high mountain. She saw a cage crafted from the roots of an oak tree. Then she set her hand to it again and turned it as a watchmaker might wind a clock. As it spun, there in the heart of the apple, she saw how the world might be lost or saved. She saw a black bull thundering down the long roads. She saw a coffin-caught phoenix unfolding feathers of flame. She saw a tattered traveller shaking the fixings of the 9 strong locks of hell.
We're here to talk about Elizabeth Garner's Lost and Found, a treasure trove of folk tales. Why is it called Lost and Found?
It's lost and found on many levels, as you would expect in folk tales to have. For me personally, these are 15 stories that I've chosen that I suppose have been most formative for me.
So these are 15 that have got their hooks into you as stories. Mm-hmm. So lost in some way because you hadn't thought about them for a long time until you were thinking about doing the book, and found because you found them again.
Yes, but I think also a lot of them feature these journeys of loss and recovery.
People losing and finding things, losing and finding themselves, losing and finding their paths.
Yeah, and what I find really fascinating about that is that it ties into the power of objects, which is something we'll talk about in a bit, but also that sense of the folklore quest. Quite often what the characters go looking for is not what they end up finding. There's an element of a quest for fate and fortune that turns into a acknowledgement of the self or an understanding of the self, which I think is really interesting.
So the 15 that you chose, they're not just retellings, are they? They're not just canonical retellings of existing stories. You've done interesting things in the way that you've adapted them.
For me, I think there's a certain logic and certain cause and effect and perimeters of these worlds that I feel if I'm rewriting I need to respect. But within that, there's so much to play around with and explore. And this is also linked to the work that I've done with our head of research education at the Blackden Trust, Dr. Tim Campbell-Green, who specialises in ritual objects, I suppose, and how mundane objects are related to ritual and finds. And when I started talking to him about what I was writing about, we kept on finding these parallels, which is something we can explore.
It's really interesting. One of the things that interests me is that it's not about a narrow sense of authenticity with these tales, that they're always being told and remade to some extent, but there is something about energy within them that you're trying to locate the kind of the energetic core of the story, which means that you, as you say, you might end up in a different place to another person's telling of the story.
I've always been fascinated in character and motivation. I mean, I even before I wrote novels, I trained as a film script editor, and it was always that relationship between plot and character that I found fascinating. In fact, shall we open up Phoebe's lovely package of illustrations?
One of the other things about the book is it has 15 beautiful illustrations for each of the tales. I wondered why you were keen to have illustrations.
I also wanted the book as an object to feel like a found thing. You know, this is what I love about the Unbound books, the creating an object that you could dive into, whether adult or child, you know, and find the details. So I was talking to Phoebe about this, Phoebe Connolly, the engraver, and what she's so wonderful with is detail. Yeah, is the detail of the motif. So shall we begin?
Yeah, let's have a look.
Let's get in there.
I love you've got a little mouse with
I know.
Ex Libris Elizabeth Garner on the front.
So this first one that we have is from the other Jack story called Stealing the Moon. In fact, should we take them out of the thing? And this is a really familiar motif, the moon raking motif. The characters who it can just be, you know, village locals that see the moon in the lake and they think it's made of cheese or that it's made of silver. But again, when I researched and dug into it in the wonderful Catherine Briggs collection, there are Jack variations where he tricks people to get the moon, and it's made of silver. But I couldn't find a variation where the characters were detailed of who he tricked. It was a group of visions. So I then sort of expanded it and thought of creating a bit of a fable of what human characteristics is Jack holding a mirror up to in this, because that's also the character of Jack. He's not just the trickster. He holds people to account, and I thought of characters that I sort of thought of Chaucer. Went back to Chaucer a bit, and characters that represented particular values, and then I thought about the objects that those characters would carry that might be useful to Jack.
Yeah.
So in fact, in terms of constructing the story, I started from the end of who deserves to be stuck down a well, and I'm not going to tell you, you have to read it. And then I threaded that back to what did Jack need. But that's all about character. It's pulling out character from these motifs, and someone else might take that story and come up with completely different characters and completely different motifs within it, and that's absolutely fine. What I love, I have to say, in Phoebe's illustration here is the shadows of the silhouettes of the people looking in.
Yes, it's lovely, isn't it? And it feels like a proper mossy, deep well as well.
Yeah.
And it's the real moon.
Yes. Yes, she's good at that. Should we look at another real moon?
What's the next one? Look, another one with the moon in.
So
I love this one.
I love this one as well. And again, this is my retelling within perimeters of a tale that I just loved as a child. And then it's called The Fairy Ointment. And again, that was in Joseph Jacobs. And then I sort of forgot it, which is a terrible thing to say. And
this is the Lost and Found.
This is the Lost and Found. And I was at the Beyond the Border Storytelling Festival, and Hugh Lupton was doing Series of Tales, and he told it. And it was such a visceral experience of remembering. And I'm not going to go into too much explanation or detail about it. But all I can say is that my setting of the other world that the character goes into, in some versions it's an other world under a hill. It can be a shack that is transformed into a palace. But in my version, I made it an oak tree.
Yeah. Simply
because as a child, I had a den in an oak tree that I really did want to lead to another world. And having the fiddle in there is also significant, but I can't explain that without giving away the ending.
No. But the moon and the oak tree and the fiddler, whose face you can barely discern, it's beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah.
What I love about the illustrations is that they have got this sense of being made out of our world. You know, she's very, very good on all the details of plants and animals and people's clothing, but the overall effect is one of somewhere completely magical and parallel and different, which I think is interesting, because that's what you're trying to create, that world through the stories. I mean, they link into one another in various ways, don't they?
Yes, they do, and also that sense that this other world is closer to our world than we might think. And again, here is beautiful example of that in Phoebe's
And this is quite a
illustration.
famous story, isn't it?
The Black Wall of Norway. Yeah, I think it's funny though, because I think it was my favourite story as a child. I don't know how famous it is. I think it's one that it's storytellers who encounter it and love
storytellers
it.
tell it.
Yeah,
maybe that's true.
yeah. And my version of it.
It's probably not canonical, as they say. I mean,
maybe not.
It's not Jack and the Beanstalk. You're
no,
right.
no. But I just loved it, and I loved it from a very young age. The basic premise of it is youngest of three sisters, which I am, and they're waiting. They each wait on their doorstep for their fate to come and claim them. So the eldest sister gets a golden carriage, younger sister, middle sister gets a silver carriage, and younger sister bloody great big black bull, and they go off on adventures together, and it's full of beautiful, odd, poetic,
I mean, who wouldn't
strange
want a
love
bull
trials.
over a carriage?
Yeah, exactly. Especially if you can't see who's inside the carriage. At least you get a bull, you know what you're dealing with.
Spoiler alert.
But it's a love trial, and I think what's so fascinating about it is that it is full of these very, very old motifs. It's something that I unpacked with Tim Campbell Green. Rituals around iron, rituals around washing. I don't really want to give too much away. And actually, my retelling of it, I unpacked all of that.
But that sense of always the best stories they feel like they're the tip of a very deep iceberg, don't they?
Yeah.
Or an outcrop of rock from a huge mountain or sort of system of underground caverns.
Yeah.
And
possibly what, again, this goes back to the lost and found, possibly what remains in that distillation in the story is the stuff that's really important. And this is going to...
It may not make perfect sense, but
narratively, yeah. Before we go, I've got a lovely example of that show, but before we go on for that, I just point out this is another wonderful bit of Phoebe's reference, because like I said, this was one of my favourite stories as a child, and I wasn't it wasn't unusual, probably I have to ask my mum for the exact time, but probably when I was about 6 or 7, for me to dress up in various bits of costume and just sit at the log pile at the front gate imagining things. and the track here and the landscape is actually the track up to the front gate at Blackden.
Oh, wonderful.
Which is just lovely. And this is the final most referencing Blackden illustration. So this is from Johnny He Not, the Changeling story. And what we have here is Phoebe's recreation of the timber frame chimney at the Blackden Trust, at the house that I grew up in.
Yeah,
the old medicine house.
Amazing.
And this goes back to what it's saying about old motifs being found in folk tales. So I would say, lost ritual being found in these stories. Because, again, through conversations with Tim Campbell Green, this idea of the chimney as a threshold and having to be protected. And one of the things that protects from a changeling is iron. And we would find iron caches of iron, and we would find protective marks on the chimney. And in fact, this chimney here, to be honest, Johnny He Not wouldn't have stood a chance because it is very highly magically protected. But we had to put him in there anyway.
And there's only a little tiny detail of him. It's only more. What's the last one here?
Yes.
This is Little Stupid.
This is Little Stupid, and this is the glass apple and the silver saucer, in which fortunes can be seen. And it is probably the best example
This is
we
your
can
Blue
have.
Peter moment.
Here's what I prepared earlier. There we go. So this Phoebe actually took the illustrative detail from this. And you know what? I had really great godparents. My godmother, Patricia Elliott, who worked as an editor, I think originally. She's now an author. Was always encouraging of my imagination, and she knew this was one of my favourite stories. And once for my birthday, she got me the glass apple and the silver saucer. I think my mum found for me. But Little Stupid in Arthur Ransom versions, always Little Stupid. In the Asenath original, it's just Fool.
Right.
And a lot happens to her.
Yeah.
And she learns quite a lot about human nature. But her name doesn't change. And I really thought about that. And I realised, she's not stupid and she's not a fool. She's the wise fool. She sees and yet she trusts in the moment.
Yeah.
I then went back to the idea of the scrying object, because that's what this is.
Yeah.
I should have made that clear at the start.
The transparent apple is used to see past and future.
In the originals, only the wider world.
Right.
But that's exactly it. In my version, I dug a little bit deep and thought at kind of scrying rituals and took creative license. So on the first night she looks into the apple, she turns it widdershins, she turns it anti-clockwise, and she sees past events. And I realised at that moment that those past events that she sees were incidents from the tales that are read before Where Little Stupid is placed in the collection.
Ah.
And then the next night she turns it clockwise and she sees the future. And I laid little images from future tales in the collection. And then on the third night she turns it both ways and she sees the present moment, because that was the start of me interweaving these little motifs, because there are echoes and characters, and just as in Phoebe's illustrations there are just lots of little nods to future stories and past stories as they collect. And of course that's actually how these stories would have travelled. Their currency, they would have travelled trade routes, so they would have been embellished by bits of other people's stories.
And I love the idea that the apple is sort of, the illustration makes it look like it's sort of spinning.
Mm.
And it's like the vortex at the core of the book, isn't it?
Mm.
Past and future stories kind of are being kind of sucked into it. How beautiful.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
This has been lovely. It's been lovely to unpack it a little bit together.
And we should say that the book is being published in September.
Yes.
And people can pre-order it now on the Unbound website. And it will be, it'll be available in all good bookstores.
Yes, and hopefully I'll be doing a few events with John Dipper and James Patterson, who have very generously donated music. As we have,
so sound as well as pictures.
Yes, and I'm just very much looking forward to it. It's an unbound book if ever there was one.
That's very true. Brilliant. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.
She never came home again. She never came home again. When the moon it went down. Oh, Ellum do grieve, and Oak he do hate, but Willow, 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 Willow do walk if you travel